North Carolina, we saw the results of these policies when a 23-year-old woman who came here from Ukraine met her bloody end on a public train. And here's a picture of it. This is the picture of it. And this is a picture of the woman, a beautiful young girl that never had problems in life.
Her name was Iryna Zarutska, 23 years old, a refugee who fled bombs in Kyiv with her family, hoping to find safety in America. But in August of 2025, on a quiet Charlotte light rail train, her story ended in a way that stunned a nation. Who was Iryna? And why has her murder become more than a local tragedy? Why has it ignited outrage across the United States and abroad? This case is not only about a young woman's life cut short. It is about the failures of a system meant to protect the vulnerable. A justice system that allowed a man with a long history of crime to walk free. It is about politics, bail reform, crime policies, and bitter divides that erupted after her death. And it is about the haunting irony. A daughter who escaped war only to be killed in the very country her family believed would shield her from harm. Her story demands answers. For Iryna Zarutska, the nightmare ended the moment that train came to a stop. But for her family, her community, and for the nation, the questions are just beginning. And at the heart of it all, how could this have happened? Kyiv, Ukraine. Born in 2002, she grew up surrounded by family, friends, and the familiar rhythms of a city she loved. Those who knew her describe a young woman with a heart of gold. Someone who cared deeply for animals, who spent hours sketching designs for clothes she dreamed of one day, bringing to life. She was so gentle, she wanted to be a veterinary assistant, because animals always seemed to find comfort with her. That was Iryna.
You know, when you have horrible killings, you have to take horrible actions. For far too long, Americans have been forced to put up with Democrat-run cities that set loose savage, bloodthirsty criminals to prey on innocent people. Really very, very innocent people. In every place, they control radical left judges, politicians, and activists, and they've adopted a policy of catch and release for thugs and killers.
She had this way of making everyone feel safe. But in 2022, Russia's full-scale invasion shattered that world. For Iryna and her family, the choice was no longer between dreams, it was survival. Her mother, her sister, her brother, they fled. Her father, like so many Ukrainian men of fighting age, stayed behind. In August 2022, after days of uncertainty and fear, the Zarutska family arrived in the United States. Their destination, Charlotte, North Carolina, a city thousands of miles from Kyiv, but one they hoped would finally give them peace. In Charlotte, Iryna rebuilt her life. Friends remember her as creative, kind, always smiling. She took English classes, cared for pets in her neighborhood, and spoke often about her dream to heal, to help, to be a voice for the voiceless animals she loved. She wasn't just a refugee. She was an artist, a daughter, a sister, and someone who believed America was her chance at a safer life. But that new life, hard-won, fragile, was cut short. Iryna's story is not just about tragedy. It is about a young woman who carried her dreams across continents, only to be remembered now in headlines. Before she became a symbol, she was someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone whose story deserves to be told in full. The LYNX Blue Line opened in 2007, and it was North Carolina's first modern light rail. At the time, it was seen as a big step forward. A system that stretched almost 20 miles with 26 stations, carrying thousands of people every day from the university in the north, through uptown Charlotte, down to the south end. It wasn't just a train, it was a promise of progress, of growth, of a city stepping into the future. And for years that promise seemed real. The Blue Line brought new life to neighborhoods. Businesses opened along its path. Apartments rose near stations. Billions of dollars in development followed the tracks. For many it became a lifeline, a way to get to work, to school, to connect with the heart of the city. But beneath the success, problems grew. Safety problems. Problems that riders noticed long before Iryna's final ride. In 2025 alone, at least 5 people were hurt in separate incidents on Blue Line trains. Riders spoke of fights breaking out, of harassment, of moments where no one stepped in because there was no one there to step in. Security was thin, patrols were inconsistent, and the system relied on a proof of payment method, where tickets are supposed to be checked, but often aren't. For many that meant anyone could walk onto a train without oversight. Some commuters admitted they often rode without seeing a single officer. Others said the platforms felt abandoned, especially at night. For people who used the train every day, the experience was mixed. Some described it as fast, affordable, and essential. Others described fear. A woman told reporters she avoids the train after dark. A man said he never sees guards, and he worries about who might sit next to him. For some, each ride felt like a gamble. The system is run by the Charlotte Area Transit System, CAT. Created in 1999, it manages both bus and rail service for Mecklenburg County. But CAT has faced years of criticism, from budget shortfalls, to delays in maintenance, to leadership struggles. Recently, the state auditor launched an investigation into how the agency handles safety. The findings could reshape how Charlotte thinks about public transit. Because now, after Iryna's death, CAT is not only questioned about efficiency, but about life and death responsibility. The East-West Boulevard station, where Iryna was killed, is one of the busiest stops on the line. It sits in a growing South End neighborhood, filled with shops, bars, and new apartments. By day, it's alive with workers and students. By night, it can feel very different. Quiet platforms, dark corners, and a sense of being alone even when others are near. On August 2025, that's where the cracks in the system showed in the most painful way possible. The blue line was meant to be Charlotte's symbol of progress. Instead, today it is at the center of a national debate. Can a city celebrate growth while failing to protect its passengers? Can a transit system survive when its riders no longer feel safe? For Iryna, these questions came too late. But for everyone else who steps onto those trains, they remain urgent. The blue line still runs. Its trains still glide into the East-West station. But the shadow of what happened now hangs over every platform, every ride. And that shadow takes us to the next part of this story, the day it all unfolded. It was the night of August 2025, a warm evening in Charlotte, North Carolina. Like many others, Iryna Zarutska boarded the city's Blue Line train at the East-West Boulevard station. She was just another passenger heading home, expecting a short and safe ride. Surveillance cameras inside the train captured the moments leading up to the tragedy. The footage shows Iryna stepping into a train car and taking her seat. She looked calm, unaware that danger was sitting only a few feet behind her. Behind her sat Decarlos Brown Jr., a 34-year-old man with a long history of arrests and violent behavior. That night he carried a folding knife. He appeared restless, shifting in his seat, watching the passengers in front of him. Among them was Iryna. For about 4 minutes, nothing happened. The train rolled down the tracks. Passengers looked at their phones. Some chatted quietly. It was the ordinary silence of a late train ride. Then, without warning, everything changed. Brown suddenly leaned forward, pulled out the knife, and attacked Iryna. He struck her multiple times. The car filled with screams as passengers panicked, rushing toward the doors, trying to get away. The calm of the ride had turned to chaos in an instant. Eyewitnesses later described the scene as terrifying. One passenger said it felt unreal, a nightmare playing out in front of them. Another told reporters they froze, unable to process what was happening. For those inside the train, the attack was sudden, brutal, and left them powerless to stop it. As the train slowed to its next stop, passengers ran for safety. The doors opened, and in the middle of the confusion, Decarlos Brown stepped off the train. But he didn't get far. Police officers were already nearby. They had been alerted by calls from witnesses, and moved quickly to intercept. Brown was arrested almost immediately on the platform. The knife, still in his possession, was taken as evidence. For Iryna, there was no time. Emergency workers rushed in, but the injuries were too severe. At just 23 years old, her life ended on that train before help could reach her. What happened inside that train lasted only minutes, but it has left a lasting scar on a family, on a city, and on a nation. A young woman who had fled the violence of war in Ukraine became the victim of violence again, this time in the country she believed would keep her safe. And at the center of it all, a man with a long record of arrests, a man who many believe should never have been free to walk onto that train in the first place. His name, Decarlos Brown Jr. His arrest would mark the beginning of a legal battle that is still unfolding today. The events of that night raised urgent questions. How could this happen in plain sight, on a train with cameras and passengers? Why was a man with a history of violence allowed to roam free? And could this tragedy have been prevented? As we move forward, we will examine who Decarlos Brown Jr. is, his long path through the justice system, and how repeated warnings were ignored until it was too late. When the train doors opened on August 22, 2025, and police led Decarlos Brown Jr. away in handcuffs, one question echoed across Charlotte. Who was this man? And how was he free to sit behind Iryna Zarutska that night? Brown was 34 years old. His criminal history was long and violent. Over the years he had been arrested at least 14 times. Charges included assault, threats, and other serious offenses. Each arrest should have been a warning sign. Yet time after time, Brown was released. Sometimes after short stays in jail, other times through cashless bail, a system meant to keep poor non-violent offenders out of crowded jails. But in this case, it returned a violent man back onto the streets. But Brown's story wasn't only about crime, it was also about illness. He had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, a mental health condition that can cause paranoia, hallucinations, and sudden outbursts. His family had seen his struggles for years. His mother later spoke through tears, saying she begged for help. She said her son needed treatment, not freedom, and she admitted what she feared most: he was dangerous. He should never have been on the streets, she said. Experts point to two failures working side by side. First, America's mental health system, which is stretched thin and often leaves people untreated once they leave a hospital or jail. And second, a justice system that moves quickly to release people, but does not ensure they get the care they need. Brown kept bouncing between courtrooms, jail cells, and the streets. But he never stayed in treatment, never stayed in custody long enough to protect the public. The cycle repeated until it ended with Iryna's death. Legal analysts call this case a tragedy, made by design. Mental health advocates say it shows how jails have become holding places for the sick, instead of centers for real treatment. Critics of bail reform argue that Brown's history should have kept him locked up. Supporters counter that the true failure was not bail, but the lack of a safety net once he was released. Either way, the result was the same: a man with a violent past, untreated and unstable, free to board a train. Was it the judges who signed Brown's release? The mental health system that never gave him long-term care? The leaders who promised safety but left riders unprotected? Or was it all of them, together? For Iryna's family, those questions are not academic. They are personal. They know what the records show, that the warnings were there, the history was clear, and even Brown's own mother had pleaded for help. And still, nothing changed. Nothing stopped him from sitting down behind Iryna that night. Now Brown faces first-degree murder charges in North Carolina, and a federal charge of causing death on a mass transportation system, a crime that could bring life in prison, even the death penalty. But for a grieving family, and for a shaken city, justice in court cannot undo what was lost, because this is not only the story of one man's violence, it is the story of a system that failed to stop him, until it was far too late. And with that failure, a young woman who escaped a war zone in Ukraine was left unprotected in the place she thought would finally be. News of the attack spread quickly, and the city of Charlotte woke up in shock. A young woman, a refugee who came to America for safety, had been killed on a train. Almost overnight, the East-West Boulevard station turned into a place of mourning. Flowers were laid along the platform. Candles burned late into the night. Strangers who had never met Iryna came to honor her, to say her name, and to call for justice. The grief was not confined to Charlotte. The Ukrainian community across the United States reacted with heartbreak and anger. They had seen Iryna's story as their own, families who fled war, who left fathers and brothers behind, who tried to rebuild in a new land. For them, the irony was unbearable. She escaped Russian bombs in Kyiv, only to fall victim to a knife in America. Ukrainian media called her death a bitter twist of fate, a tragedy that showed how violence can follow refugees even to places of refuge. Across Charlotte, petitions began circulating. Residents demanded stronger safety on public transit. They called for more officers, more inspections, more accountability from KTS and city leaders. At vigils, voices rose in both sorrow and anger. Some carried Ukrainian flags. Others held signs that read simply, "Justice for Iryna." Her funeral in the United States was filled with tears and silence. Friends spoke of her kindness, her love for animals, her dream of becoming a veterinary assistant. Her mother and sister clung to each other, their voices breaking as they described the daughter and sister they had lost. But one person was missing: Iryna's father. He remained in Ukraine, unable to leave because of the war, and the rules that keep men of fighting age from crossing the border. He could only mourn from afar, watching the funeral through a screen, unable to lay his daughter to rest. For her family, the pain was almost too much to put into words. Her mother said she had promised Iryna safety, and now that promise was broken. Her sister spoke of memories, late-night laughter, shared secrets, plans for the future, all of it stolen in minutes on a train. In the days after her death, Charlotte was united in grief. But grief quickly turned into questions, and questions turned into anger. How could this have happened? Who allowed a man with a long history of violence to sit behind her that night? And what would be done to make sure it never happened again? The immediate aftermath of Iryna's death was sorrow and outrage, but soon it would grow into something larger, a debate that reached from Charlotte to Washington, from local courtrooms to international headlines. After the shock came the search for justice. Prosecutors in North Carolina quickly charged Decarlos Brown Jr. with first-degree murder. Under state law, it is the most serious charge possible. If convicted, Brown faces life in prison without parole, or the death penalty, though North Carolina has not carried out an execution in years. But the case did not stop there. Within weeks, federal prosecutors stepped in. They charged Brown with causing death on a mass transportation system. It is a rarely used law, designed to punish crimes committed on trains, planes, and buses. This federal charge is severe. It carries the possibility of life in prison, or even the death penalty. Legal experts say the decision to file both state and federal charges shows how seriously authorities view this case. State prosecutors will focus on murder under North Carolina law, while federal prosecutors emphasize the larger danger, a deadly attack on public transit, an attack that put every passenger at risk. Similar cases have been rare but powerful. In the past, federal courts have used the same law for deadly assaults on airplanes and buses. Each time, the federal system sought maximum punishment, to send a message that violence on public transit will not be tolerated. As of now, Brown's legal process is only beginning. Pre-trial hearings are expected to continue into next year. Lawyers are preparing motions, and the court will decide whether federal prosecutors will pursue the death penalty. If both state and federal trials move forward, it could take years before a final verdict is reached. For Iryna's family, and for a shaken city, the charges bring some hope of justice. But they also raise new questions. Will the courts deliver swift accountability, or will the slow grind of trials and appeals delay closure once again? Iryna Zarutska's murder did more than shock Charlotte. It triggered a political storm that reached the highest levels of government. Within days, President Donald Trump weighed in. From the White House podium and on the campaign trail, he pointed to the killing as proof that Democratic-led cities are, in his words, soft on crime. He argued that repeated releases, lenient judges, and weak transit security created the conditions that allowed Decarlos Brown Jr. to attack. His allies echoed the same message, that public safety has collapsed because violent offenders face no real consequences. Democratic leaders, in Charlotte and beyond, pushed back. They insisted the case is not about partisanship, but about systemic failures. A broken mental health system, courts with limited tools, and a transit network that had been underfunded for years. They accused the president of turning a family's tragedy into a political weapon. At the center of the debate is bail reform. Brown had been released multiple times under cashless bail, a policy meant to protect poor defendants from unfair jail time. But critics now say the system failed when it treated a man with 14 prior arrests, the same as someone with a minor offense. Supporters counter that bail reform is being scapegoated. The true failure, they argue, was the absence of long-term treatment and supervision for a man known to be mentally ill and dangerous. That brings the focus to mental health care. Brown was diagnosed with schizophrenia years ago, and his mother had pleaded for help. But America's mental health system remains thin, with too few treatment centers and too little long-term care. Experts say what happened on that train is the predictable outcome of a society that relies on jails instead of hospitals, and release forms instead of real intervention. Meanwhile, Charlotte officials came under fire for the state of the city's transit system. Mayor Vi Lyles promised reforms, more patrols on the Blue Line, more cameras, and stricter fare enforcement. But those promises came only after Iryna's death. And soon after, the North Carolina State Auditor launched a review of CATS, Charlotte's transit agency, focusing on security contracts, spending, and accountability. Writers asked a blunt question: why did it take a killing for leaders to act? Local reporting had already shown signs of trouble. Before Iryna's murder, at least 5 people were injured on the Blue Line in 2025. What was once Charlotte's proudest symbol of growth now looked, to many, like a system unable to keep its riders safe. The broader debate goes beyond Charlotte. Iryna was a refugee who fled bombs in Ukraine, only to be killed on a train in the United States. That irony struck a nerve, raising questions about America's ability to protect those who seek safety here. Activists warned against politicizing her death, but admitted it highlights deeper failures in crime prevention, in justice, in healthcare, and in refugee protection. Analysts, activists, and grieving families now wrestle with the same question: who holds responsibility? Was it the judges who signed release orders, the health system that never gave lasting care, city leaders who neglected transit safety, or a political climate that talks about safety only after tragedy? In the end, the arguments differ. But the reality is the same. Iryna's death has become more than personal grief. It is now a test of America's systems, and whether they can change before another tragedy unfolds. Before the headlines, before the politics, before the courtroom battles, there was simply Iryna. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend. At just 23, she was still building her life. Those who knew her remember her smile, her kindness, her way of making others feel safe. They called her a heart of gold. Iryna loved animals. She often cared for neighborhood pets and dreamed of becoming a veterinary assistant. Friends say she carried sketchbooks filled with drawings, designs she hoped to turn into clothes one day. She had the hands of an artist, the spirit of a caregiver, and the determination of someone who had already survived war. Her family describes a young woman who never let hardship harden her. She fled the bombs of Kyiv with her mother, her sister, and her brother, searching for safety in America. She was rebuilding her life in Charlotte, studying, working, helping others, when her journey was cut short on that train. Her death has left scars that go far beyond one family. It is a story of violence against women, of refugees who carry one trauma only to face another. It is a story that forces us to ask, are we doing enough to protect the vulnerable? Are we doing enough to prevent this from happening again? In the end, Iryna's life cannot be reduced to the crime that ended it. She was more than a victim. She was a young woman with dreams, with laughter, with love to give, and her story now demands more than outrage. It demands change. She fled bombs in Kyiv, only to fall victim to violence in Charlotte. For Iryna, the journey is over, but for us, the responsibility remains. In memory of Iryna Zarutska, 2002.